So tonight we're going to talk about sex. And we're going to talk about not only what sex is, but how sex informs gender. And I can't believe I have to have this conversation, which will probably turn into a rant, about something that we should have learned in middle school, for crying out loud. So I will probably have to splice this rant up in editing to make it a little bit more interesting and easy to follow for those at home who don't understand these really basic ideas. And I want to say just briefly why it is I'm doing this video. A few nights ago, I spent the night in Destiny's Discord server, where the entire server just doesn't understand the basic concepts that we're going to be talking about today, that again, they should have learned in middle school. So part of that time that I spent in that Discord server was spent with, I'll call him a friend of mine. He's a user on Matt Christensen's Discord server as well. His handle there is Magic Sky Fairy. If I mention him again in this video, it will be with the shorthand Magic. So we'll call him a friend of mine. And he was the one doing most of the, if you will, debating in that channel, in the channel that we were in on Destiny's Discord server. So let's start with some really basic stuff. And where we're going to start is with the word assignment. And this harkens back to the notion that sex is assigned at birth. Okay, so assignment, as Magic pointed out, implies that there is some form of agency involved with the actual assignment. More importantly, what it means is that you are taking from the doctor and conferring something onto the baby. And that's just not how this works. Sex is something that we observe in nature. So when a doctor sees a penis on a baby and says, boy, he's not assigning male, as far as sex is concerned, to the baby. The baby is basically informing the doctor of its own sex by having a penis. So the direction of information is completely backwards when you have this idea that sex is assigned at birth. And we're going to get into what sex is in just a moment, but we have to get over this hump. The doctor doesn't assign the sex. The doctor observes the sex. The doctor is informed by the baby what the sex is. In this case, the doctor discovers the sex. He's not assigning it. He's discovering it. In the same way that scientists could discover the mass of the sun. It's not something that they're assigning to the sun. An astronomer is not going to assign the mass of a celestial body to the celestial body. They're going to discover it. The celestial body and what it does and the characteristics of that celestial body are going to inform the scientist, the astronomer, as to what their mass is. This is why, by the way, sex is not even determined at birth. This is why my brother, whose wife right now is, I think it's 13 weeks in, we've still got almost 6 months to go before this baby is going to be born, and we already know her sex. And we know that it's a her because we can determine its sex. This is also how we can determine the sex of people who lived and died thousands of years ago and for whom we have no record other than the fossil record. This is how we can look at a cat and determine its sex. Again, we're not assigning the cat a sex, and we'll come back to the notion of a cat and sex in a moment. We're not assigning the cat its sex. We're determining its sex. So the only way that you can get to a world where a baby is assigned its sex at birth is to completely nuke like a third of the English language and genuinely everything we know in the scientific community and completely scrap it for something else. And the reason that we've achieved what we have in the world of science, the reason we are at the position we are at when it comes to these words and how we understand things in the field of science is because the models we have worked. And the models we have withstood have withstood principle. There is no consistent way to build a principled model, scientific model of the world by completely nuking the notion of how information flows, by completely reversing how observation works. When we see something and we see a characteristic, it is informing us, not the other way around. And as a result, in order to have this notion that the doctor is somehow informing the child of its sex is a complete reversal of every tenet on which everything within the realm of science has been founded. So no, that's not how any of this works. An assignment, again, requires the notion of agency. An assignment is what somebody informs you of. When your boss assigns you a duty, the boss is informing you. The boss is giving you the duty and the responsibility. So we're going to come back to gender in just a moment, but first we have to talk about sex. And there's a reason we have to talk about sex, and especially as it relates to how it informs gender. But I kind of have to walk on eggshells here because there's one subject you're not allowed to talk about on YouTube, and this is it. For some reason, this is a subject you're not even allowed to even touch on mainstream social outlets such as YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, the usual totalitarian subjects. So this is what sex is. Here we go. Sex is the potential parent one would be in sexual reproduction. Now, I know I kind of used the word in its own definition by saying sexual reproduction, and we will get to that in just a minute. But first, I want to start off with the word parent, because in this case, I mean the biological definition of the word parent. I mean parent in the biological context. So when it comes to asexual reproduction, to contrast with sexual reproduction, what we usually talk about is a parent cell and their offspring, which is a daughter cell. So in this case, the colloquial definition and common parlance definition of parent isn't sufficient to meet the biological definition in the same way that the common parlance definition of scarcity, which is the definition that you'll find in the dictionary, isn't sufficient to meet the definition in the economics context. So if you open up an economics textbook, the definition of scarcity provided there is going to be slightly different from the definition that you'll see in a dictionary. And there's a reason for that. And again, that is that the dictionary definition isn't sufficient to meet the context of the definition in this case. So this is what a parent means. And that's actually going to naturally segue into what sexual reproduction is so that we can then further define the word sex and talk about what sex is and why that is axiomatically a word and idea that is broken down into a dichotomy. So with sexual reproduction, in contrast to asexual reproduction, there is a meiotic process that in almost every case produces a haploid sequence. And these haploids then meet to reproduce. Sexual reproduction is the creation of new life through the sharing of genetic material. And again, it is almost always done through meiotic processes that result in a haploid sequence. Since the context of this conversation has always centered around human beings, because they are mammals, and this is true of all mammals, produce gamete. The gamete is what winds up as the end result of the haploid sequence. So in the haploid sequence, you go through the meiotic processes, not the mitotic process. Mitotic reproduction is usually what you have with asexual reproduction. With sexual reproduction, when you go through these meiotic processes, you produce a haploid. In human beings, that haploid is effectively the gamete. There are only two types of gamete. They are the male gamete and they are the female gamete. This is true of all mammals and the overwhelming majority of the animal kingdom when it comes to sexual reproduction. So since the context is human beings, we're going to talk about the context under which human beings function, not the context under which invertebrates function, and the context under which salamanders sometimes function. So when we talk about gamete, there are only two types of gamete. They are male and they are female. In order to sexually reproduce, genetic material must be shared between a male and a female gamete. This is axiomatic. There is no third type of gamete. The only way genetic material can be shared is between two organisms. There's no possible way to share genetic material between three organisms and get a new organism that has the shared genetic material of all three of those original organisms. It's not possible. Not in any element of life. Not in terms of viruses, not in terms of unicellular life, not in terms of bacteria, protists, fungi, plants, or animals. It's not possible to sexually reproduce with three, in this case, parents. This is why Punnett squares are a square in 2 dimensions rather than a Punnett cube. And remember these Punnett squares that we all had to draw in 7th grade biology. So remember, this is what I was talking about when I said we were going to be talking about middle school biology. The reason they're a square is because the 2 axes represent the 2 parents. In this case, the example I'm going to be using is brown eyes versus blue eyes. So this is something that's incredibly easy to draw out in a Punnett square, and I'm aware of the fact that Punnett squares don't perfectly predict every sharing of alleles that could be manifest, and even when it comes to eye color, because there is such a thing as gray eyes, there is such a thing as green eyes, there is such a thing as many colors of eyes, there is such a thing as a human being actually having 2 different colors of eyes, even though that's incredibly rare. It is not possible for gamete, which is female, to sexually reproduce with gamete, which is female. And since there is this natural dichotomy, this is basically a law of nature, by the way. It's something that we observe in nature. It's not something that we're looking to explain in the way that Einstein's theory of gravity or Newton's theory of gravity looks to explain gravity. No, we're talking about something like thermodynamics, which is a mere observation of things like the conservation of energy. The conservation of energy isn't there to explain something. It's there to describe what we've observed in nature. So we're kind of talking about a prioristic knowledge here when we say something like, there is only male and there is only female gamete. In the sense that, although we have observed that gamete exists, although we have observed that you need opposite gametes in order to reproduce sexually, the notion that these 2 gametes are opposite is built into the definition of the thing, which means that a male gamete can never be a female gamete, and a female gamete can never be a male gamete, in the same way that a bachelor cannot be a married man, because the way we define a bachelor is as an unmarried man. The way we define male gamete is as the opposite of female gamete. So when we talk about a prioristic knowledge, we're talking about information we have before observation, prior to observation. So I'll have to do a video in my series in philosophical concepts to expand on what is meant by a priori and what is meant by the word axiomatic, because they're very closely related. And it'll probably be a single video so that I can expand on this idea further. But for the sake of concision, remember that there are only male and female gametes, and again, it is axiomatically true that they are opposites because of how we define the thing. There is no other gamete. There are only 2 gametes, and you need opposite gametes in order to reproduce sexually. So that part requires observation, but the notion that they are opposites, that is an a priori thing. You would have to come up with wholly new words that would mean the exact same thing in order to describe accurately what we are actually observing. So that is why there are male and female gametes. And when it comes to human sex, the way we determine somebody's sex is by the gamete that they would produce if they were capable of reproducing sexually. Now, I know what a lot of people are going to say. Well, Mike, there are tons of people out there that can't produce gamete. And for the record, in all mammals, that gamete is egg and sperm. Female gamete in all mammals is egg. Female gamete in all male gamete, in all mammals is sperm. You have to have sperm, you have to have egg. You have to have exactly one of both in order to reproduce sexually in all mammals, which obviously includes human beings. So the provider of the sperm, or the potential provider of the sperm in sexual reproduction, is the male parent. The potential provider of egg is the female parent. There's no third direction. There's no ambiguity on any of this. Again, this is how we define the thing. It's something that we could know, again, before there is any observation, that there is only male parent and only female parent, because the way we define these parents The way we describe their sex is based on gamete. And gamete, in this case, only has two sexes, male and female gamete. There are organisms that are capable of producing fully viable male and female gamete. Many plants are capable of doing this. Humans are not plants, however. Humans are not capable of doing that. Now, I know what a lot of people are going to say. Mike, there are lots of people who are incapable of producing sperm, and there are lots of people who are incapable of producing egg. And my response is yes, there are. In the United States, there's tens of millions of them. We call them children. But we can still know what a child's sex is, even though they may not be capable of producing sperm or egg. And I didn't even qualify sperm or egg with viable, because lots of people can produce sperm, lots of people can produce egg, and in some of those cases, in a lot of those cases actually, the sperm and the egg are not viable. This is true of a lot of human beings. However, you are not capable of producing both egg and sperm. So how do we know somebody's sex if they're not capable of producing sperm or egg, or if they simply haven't yet produced sperm or egg? So over the course of human history, there have been a lot of markers that have been extremely effective to determine somebody's sex. The presence of a penis and testes without the presence of a vagina and ovaries is usually a very good indicator that the person in that case is male. It's not perfect, but it's a very good indicator. In the case of somebody who has a vagina and ovaries and no penis or testes, it's usually a very good indicator that they are female. This idea alone, this metric alone, has been the only metric by which human beings have been capable of reproducing until around 130 years ago, when we started to understand better genetic characteristics of all organisms, including human beings. It wasn't until we really started to expand our understanding of genetics, which again didn't happen until the latter part of the 19th century, that we started to understand how it is that babies are formed in reality and what the more accurate way of determining sex is. However, we exist, which means it must have been an extremely effective way of doing things. And the truth is that, again, the overwhelming majority of human beings who have a penis and testes and no vagina and ovaries are male. And the exceptions to this rule are extraordinarily rare. They're not just rare, they're extraordinarily rare. So, although this metric hasn't been the perfect way to make that determination, we've over time come up with better ways to determine somebody's sex. The next leap, of course, was chromosomal analysis. Chromosomal analysis isn't a perfect indicator of what somebody's sex is. We've now learned about alleles, and we've also learned about extraordinarily rare exceptions to the XXXY dichotomy. However, there is one element of our genetic code, which is the basic building block of the genetic code, and thus is the determiner of sex at a perfect level, and that's a DNA analysis. We can, by analyzing someone's DNA, perfectly predict and perfectly determine their actual sex. This is how we're able to do this with mummies. This is how we're able to determine the sex of somebody who lived and died 10,000 years ago. So although DNA perfectly accurately predicts someone's sex and perfectly accurately indicates someone's sex upon analysis, there's an even simpler way to determine somebody's sex, and that is with determining which gamete they actually produce. In human beings, the easiest way to do this is to have two parents sexually reproduce, and then we can know right away which sex that they belong to. The provider of the sperm in that case is the male, and the provider of the egg in that case is the female. And this isn't just true by observation. This is axiomatically true. This is true by the very definition of the thing. So there's going to be a lot of complaints, I'm sure, about this video about the notion of intersex. Okay, intersex is a real thing. Intersex isn't a third sex. It is a condition of sex. And sex is not a conglomeration of sex characteristics. Sex is a thing unto itself. Sex is the characteristic. It's not determined by the characteristics. It is the thing that in large part informs and determines the characteristics. So in this case, again, the left had this completely backwards, and that chat room that we were in, or channel, that we were in on Destiny's Discord server. So in this case, again, It's not the conglomeration of characteristics. It is the characteristic. It is the thing that informs all of these other traits and all of these other observable characteristics. So I said we'd talk about intersex, so let's go ahead and have that conversation. Like I said, intersexed is a condition of sex, not a third sex unto itself. And no, sex is not a spectrum. It is defined by the dichotomy of male and female. Remember that. So I'm going to repeat it. Sex is defined by the dichotomy of male and female. By definition, there are only two sexes. Intersexed is when these outward characteristics that I just mentioned don't perfectly align with somebody's actual sex. So when you are a male and you exhibit a ton of feminine characteristics, it's not the characteristics that make you male. It's your biology which makes you male. Which means that even if you have breasts, even if you don't have testes and don't have a penis, even if you prefer to have long hair, even if your interests are more on humans than on things, even if you tend to be shorter and smaller of frame, even if you have a more high-pitched voice, all of these characteristics aren't the thing that determines your sex. So if you feel like you're a female, that doesn't actually determine whether or not you are a female. We can go to your DNA and determine with absolutely perfect accuracy what sex you are. In fact, in many cases, we don't have to do that. Were you able to produce sperm as a teenager? Then you are male. Did you have a period, and did that period release egg? That means that you are female. Now, there is such a thing as true hermaphrodism. And the reason I'm going with the phrase true hermaphrodism is because that alone is already a mouthful. And the scientific name for this condition is something that I'm going to have a really hard time saying. So in order to avoid that mouthful and to substitute it with another mouthful, which by the way is the term that we used in biology for a very long time until very recently before we came up with the newer term. So because of that, I'm going to just say true hermaphrodism. Not only is this a rare condition of sex, this is the rarest condition of sex. And when I say rare, in human history, we've known of a few hundred people that have actually exhibited this condition. Not thousands, a few hundred of these cases in all of human existence. True hermaphrodism is a condition where you have at the very least both ovaries and testes. In even rarer cases, you also have a penis as well as a vagina. In every single one of these cases, sperm was not capable of being produced. In fact, in the majority of these cases, as I recall, I'll correct myself in editing if need be, the majority of these cases, the parents were not capable of producing viable gamete at all. And of those that did, every single one of them produced only female gamete. That means that in this case, in this circumstance, with this condition, everyone that has had this condition so far has been female. It is not possible for a human being to impregnate themselves. So in the same way that we can know that there are no married bachelors because of the definition of the word bachelor, we can know that there are only two sexes because of how we define the two sexes, because of how we define the notion of opposite, because we know that in biology that you need to have one of two types of gametes in order to sexually reproduce, and that there are only two gametes, and that the way we define the gametes is as either male or female, and the way we define male and female is as opposites. Which means there are only two sexes. By definition, very basic biology. So then what is gender? I'll give you the very short version here, but I'll have to break this video up into two parts because this is already getting cumbersomely long, and I don't want to spend 3 days in the editing room to get one video out. So I'll give you the short version. Gender is an extension of grammar. It's a linguistic tool and nothing else. It's not some sort of how do you feel about what sex you are. It's not the conglomeration of characteristics of masculine that we would call masculine and feminine in common parlance. It's an element of grammar. In English, as in all Germanic languages, there are technically 3 genders. Those are masculine, feminine, and neuter. Also in English, and we'll get into why this is the case in the next video, we have reduced those 3 genders to 1, the neuter gender, in virtually every case. So when I say a sentence as simple as, the cat plays with her mouse, her is not the only thing that is experiencing gender. The 2 instances of the word the are also experiencing gender. In this case, because I speak English, the is the only word we have for the. In this case, we've reduced the genders to 1 gender, which is, in this case, the neuter gender, the neuter case. There are extremely rare exceptions to this rule when it comes to the word the, and when it comes to things like inanimate objects. And we'll get into that in the next video. But for the most part, we've gotten rid of that. The only place where we haven't gotten rid of gender is when we're talking about individuals upon whom we've ascribed agency. And we'll get into that in the next video. So, thanks for sticking with me, and we'll see you in the next one. Night, folks.